Well, hello there, everyone. Welcome to Political Fight Club. It's a stormy night here in Peoria, Illinois, and I thought it'd be a good time to read you guys a story. And no shit, I don't know if the power's going to go out while this is going on, but it seemed like since it's the right atmosphere for some horror, I thought I might read to you about Wall Street and short selling. So the first part of this episode is going to be about 10 to 15 minutes of me reading and commenting on what short sales are. And this chapter is really broken into two parts, where the first part's talking about how when these large financial firms bet against other financial firms to die, meaning when you do a short sale, you you borrow money to buy a stock, and then if that company stock goes down, you actually can make up the difference between how much you bought in for with the borrowed money and what it currently stands at. So you're actually incentivized to do whatever you can to make these companies you're betting against tank. So a lot of these big firms and these billionaires, what they do is they short sell, doing what I just told you in a very complicated manner, which we're going to go over here in a kind of entertaining way that Matt Taibbi writes, to make a bunch of money and then force out a whole bunch of these smaller firms using the most ridiculous tactics ever. And that's what the second half of the chapter is about. It's about this guy who's basically like a financial firm, a hitman type, where he gets paid by billionaires to literally pull out every punch you can possibly do, the shadiest stuff you've ever heard of, to get companies' stock prices to drop. And this includes things like harassing people that work there, calling their houses in the middle of the night, threatening the people that have a lot of stock or the owners of these small firms. And it goes as far as like paying certain journalists to smear these firms with false allegations just to try to get their stocks to drop enough so that the billionaires can make a bunch of money off of them. And this guy is the dirtiest dude I've ever heard of. His name's Contegoris. Could you think of a more aptly named person? He sounds like a fucking villain from a Bond movie. And I'm going to read you about a little bit what he did actually to try to get this firm called Fairfax Financial Holdings to die. Now, that's what the whole chapter is about, is Fairfax Financial Holdings. A short sale was put out, basically a hit on this by a bunch of billionaires, and they did everything that they could to kill the firm, and they didn't in the end. Fairfax ended up fighting them off, but it's insane the lengths to which they went to make a couple $1 billion on putting this firm out of business. So I'm going to read to you here. Give me about 5 to 10 minutes here to read you about 6 pages. Wall Street in 2003 was a very different place from the world Ben Graham had written about in his 1934 Security Analysis. A more definitive portrait of modern finance would probably be the movie Wall Street, which had a profound effect on the city's business culture, although probably not the effect its heavy-handed lefty director Oliver Stone expected. While the rest of America understood that Michael Douglas's iconic Gordon Gekko character is a villain and saw his famed "Greed is good" speech as an incisive satire, many aspiring Wall Street traders sincerely thought and still think that Gordon Gekko is a movie hero. And that would go for Wolf of Wall Street as well, man. A lot of those people, Wall Streeters, they think that Jordan Belfort is like some sort of tragic hero, when the rest of us are watching this and like we're like, dude, it's a good thing he got caught in the end. They were doing disgusting things. In the early 90s, Wall Street saw a massive influx of young Gekko wannabes who thought waiting any amount of time to get fabulously wealthy was for losers, or at the very least for people who had never read Sun Tzu. He wrote The Art of War, which we'll probably do on a different episode. Many of these New World beaters eschewed the old Wall Street career path of being a broker at a major investment bank and climbing the ladder to a partnership. Instead, they reached for a more direct path to the top. They started hedge funds. Hedge funds, basically big pools of money managed by professional traders, are almost totally unregulated. A fund often begins as a one-man operation, run by a smooth-talking Wall Street frontman who trolls the very rich, hustling for seed money. There are no real regulatory audits of hedge funds, and no government body checks hedge funds trades or verifies their claims. It even came out in the famous Bernie Madoff case that despite numerous complaints to the SEC over the years from reputable sources, nobody in the government even checked to make sure Madoff's hedge fund even made trades at all. Madoff actually went more than 13 years without making a single stock purchase, and yet somehow survived several SEC investigations. That's how flimsy government regulation of hedge funds has been and still is. So let me read to you here about some of these velocity traders. One of them you may recognize. His name is Stevie Cohen, and he was a billionaire who I think he made something like $100 million in a year. I'm going to read to you here what these people were doing. This includes like Warren Buffett. These people did not think of themselves as part owners of companies. They boarded this or that ship only for a few minutes, raped and robbed as much as possible from the hold, and then took off back out into the open ocean. These are talking about how velocity traders, they've owned stocks for mere seconds before selling them and making money off of them. No such thing as a long trade for these people, and they make millions off of these, tens of millions sometimes. If there's any one person in the global business community who represents the total polar opposite of Warren Buffett style value investing, it's Stevie Cohen. So Warren Buffett wasn't a velocity trader. In the late 1970s, Cohen was a young arbitrage trader working for a middling firm called Gruntle & Co., where he quickly rose to a job most young men would be happy with, managing 6 traders and a $75 million fund. But in 1992, Cohen broke off and founded SAC Capital, a secretive hedge fund whose awesomely rapid rise in that decade roughly paralleled the rapid growth of Watsa's Fairfax up north. Now, Fairfax is the company they eventually go after. It's a Canadian financial firm. Watsa is not a velocity trader. He's long-term like Buffett. But it wasn't long before the compensation numbers Cohen was putting up made Watsa look like McDonald's franchisee by comparison. Within 10 years of branching off on his own, Cohen was personally earning $350 million a year. A few years after that, Cohen had nearly tripled his compensation and was earning $1 billion a year. Less than a dozen years after founding SAC, Cohen was one of the top 40 richest people in America, and he made a major statement to the rest of America's elite by building an obscene 35,000 square foot mansion in the capital of rich America, Greenwich, Connecticut. The mansion shocked even the Greenwich crowd with its sprawling grounds and its Versailles-like architecture, complete with an often visible Zamboni machine tending to a 6,000 square foot skating rink. And they go on to describe that a little bit more. So where did all that money come from? SAC had quickly become one of the world's largest hedge funds through its mysterious, impossible-sounding performance record. In the first 15 years of its existence, SAC claimed an incredible 43% annual return for its clients. Somehow, Cohen was beating the average growth of the stock market by 4, 5, or 6 times over every single year for more than a decade. Kind of like Nancy Pelosi. For such incredible performance, Cohen's clients paid a premium that went beyond enviable to being outright suspicious. The standard fee for a hedge fund manager is a formula known on Wall Street as a 2 and 20. If you give a hedge fund manager $10 million, he gets a 2% management fee for the 10 mil plus 20% of any profits he makes you. But Cohen incredibly charged his clients 50% for the profits he earned them, which is little like paying $5,000 to get a 1-hour massage from a Swedish co-ed. If you're paying that much, you're probably getting more than a massage. And with Cohen, what you paid for was guaranteed impossible profits. I like Matt Taibbi's writing. That stuff, he does that all the time. It's kind of funny. That's why it's so accessible here. Let's see here. That no one can post 40% returns for 15 years without cheating is blatantly obvious to everyone on Wall Street, but instead of sounding the general alarm, the almost universal reaction of the world financial media has been to celebrate the genius of such miracle investors with worshipful profiles, at least until Cohen was finally nailed by regulators many years after the Fairfax episode ended. Early in his career, Cohen had got to explain his system over and over again to starry-eyed reporters, and what they heard was the exact opposite of the Buffett-Graham value investing concept. Cohen claimed to be making money based on a minute-to-minute calculations made as he was monitoring trading flow, or watching the tape, as he called it. This was eerily similar to the painting the tape process that Fred Graeber taught Sam Israel. They talked about that earlier. I'm not going to get into that. When he felt stock prices were wrong, the Wall Street Journal explained, quote, Mr. Cohen would pounce and then he would bail as soon as they ticked in the right direction. His huge profits, he said, were derived from the fact that his bets were so enormous and the volume of his trading so obscene. By the mid-2000s, SAC's trading all by itself accounted for as much as 2% of all trading activity on any given day on the NYSE. SAC grew so big so fast that, like Bill Parcells or Bill Belichick, Cohen quickly saw his coaching tree start to bloom. A number of former SAC traders branched off and created their own funds. Adam Sender was a sort of mini Cohen who split off from his mentor in '98 to form his own fund, Exis Capital Management. Like Cohen, Sender quickly began turning in impossible-sounding results. He claimed 53% return after fees in '06. And like Cohen, Sender couldn't wait to show the world how rich he was. Within a decade or so after founding Exis, he had a personal collection of more than 1,000 works of modern art that were collectively valued at over $100 million. Cohen and Sender were part of a new class of hedge fund conqueror who used their instant millions and billions to buy places in pop culture limelight, usually by patronizing modern artists. Cohen shocked the art world in '05 when he gave $12 million, the highest sum ever paid to a living artist for a single piece of work, to the awesomely pretentious Englishman Damien Hirst for his The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. This preposterous sculpture was a 14-foot pickled shark suspended in formaldehyde-like solution. The notion that Cohen had paid $12 million for a kind of schlock monument to his own self-image as a financial killing machine is a long-standing joke on Wall Street, right down to the fact that the dead animals started to rot almost immediately shortly after purchase. Cohen had to hire the artist to refurbish the creature. Oh, that's funny. Let's see here. And let's go here. And lastly, there's Jim Chanos, another billionaire who was Buffett's, or the mythical Buffett's, opposite for another reason. He almost exclusively bet against companies, not on them. Now, this is where we're talking about short sales. Known as the catastrophe capitalist, and elevated to fame on Wall Street for having helped uncover the Enron disaster, he had a huge short on against Enron, and his research is said to have essentially exposed that fraud. Chanos could move markets just by signaling that he was betting against this company or that company. Humorously and appropriately, Chanos named his hedge fund Kynikos, which is Greek for cynic. He described his campaigns against target companies as jihads and became well known for his withering, devastating criticisms of just about anyone who fell within his field of view. He sneered, for instance, at traders who blindly rode the tech boom while he was doing real work seeking out bad companies like Enron. Quote, "The marginal people on the trading desks, there's no skill set," he chirped. "The next stop for them is driving a cab." On one hand, Chanos represented everything that was good about short sellers. In an investment community policed by weakling regulators and mostly blind press, it's often left to short sellers to spot and correct even the most blatant corruption, which Chanos apparently did in the Enron case. But the high roller shorts like Chanos almost by necessity have to be psychologically a little bit unhinged. An investor who bets on companies to succeed, a so-called long investor, always at the very least knows the worst case scenario when he invests in a company. But if you buy a share of IBM at $10, the most you can lose is that $10. But a short's losses can be infinite. Every time you put a big short on, you risk your entire neck. Quote, "You have to have titanium balls," is how one trader puts it. The reason has to do with the mechanics of the profession. When you short a stock, you first borrow shares in that company, then sell them off immediately for cash. Then after the stock's value has dropped, you go out and buy the same amount of shares in the open market and then return them to the original source. Like I said, complicated. Say you borrow a share of IBM at 10. You sell it immediately for that $10, then wait for something bad to happen. IBM forced to announce a product recall, let's say. The stock drops to 9. You can then go out and buy a share of IBM on the open market, return that share to your original source, and pocket a $1 profit. But what if IBM goes up? What if there's no product recall and the next product IBM comes out with puts the iPad out of business? What if the stock goes past $10 to $15, $20, $40, $50? You still eventually have to return the stock. The higher the stock climbs, the more money you owe, and there's no zero down to stop the bleeding. You could pick wrong, bet against Google or Microsoft in its infancy, and end up beyond broke, hurtling down a financial bottomless pit. Another factor is that short sellers have to pay fees to borrow stocks before they can short them, which means that if you're shorting IBM at 10, you'll probably need it to drop below 9, maybe even 8 or 7 to actually make a profit. It depends on how hard the stock is to borrow, how high those borrowing fees are. this issue would come into play in a big way in the Fairfax case. So if you're putting a big short on, you usually need to see a serious drop to make a buck, not just a tick or two in the right direction. By the early 2000s, just those four men, Cohen, Chanos, another guy named Loeb, and then Sender, collectively managed tens of billions of dollars and exerted enormous influence on the daily trading of the NYSE. And here's what we know. Sometime in 2002, this collection of high-profile, belligerent, letter-writing, art-collecting millionaires and billionaires, along with hotshots from a few other prominent hedge funds, began talking to one another about the new stock they might want to target, Fairfax Financial Holdings. So that's the first part. Sorry that was a little bit long, but that gives you an idea of what a short is. So what they decided to do, those four guys and a couple other, psychos that do this stuff, decided that they were going to take down a Canadian financial institution run by that guy named Watsa. Prem Watsa was his name. Now what he did is, because he hadn't committed barely any fraud at all. They found that they did a little bit of fraud on accident, but basically Fairfax was a clean company. And what happens with a lot of these short sales is these huge companies have so much influence and pay people like this guy I'm about to read to you about to harass these companies into submission. Their stocks start to drop. These companies are already dirty and they just fold, or they just realize it's going to be years and years and years and millions of dollars of defending themselves against these people that they just can't weather the storm, or they don't want to, and they just fold, and then these people performing the big short end up making billions of dollars off of putting these companies out of business. But Fairfax fought back for years, and they were financially sound enough to weather the storm and, stubborn enough not to fold. And so eventually these billionaires couldn't get their stock to drop enough to make any money off of it and lost. And it was just a matter of Fairfax basically holding their ground and not allowing themselves to go under. And their books were cleaner than some institutions that eventually go out. So I'm going to read to you real quickly about this guy named Spyro Contegoris. He was the wet man I was talking to you guys about, basically a financial hitman that gets paid by these billionaires to go out and reap havoc against these other smaller companies and then have journalists write horrible things about them and attempt to make it so that the public perception will make the stock drop so that these people can make money. Okay? Let's see here. Where is it? Here we go. Who was this man? The charismatic Contegoris was something like the Zelig of the market manipulation era, a kind of backroom wet man who ran mysterious errands for powerful hedge fund investors. In a stock market that was increasingly based on movements in public confidence, Contegoris was the perfect operational figure, a man who had no fixed job but was living out of a kind of inspired homage to the very idea of a confidence man. He was supremely confident in every role he played, and he played a hell of a lot of them. Michael Bowe, Fairfax's lawyer, talks with awe about Contegoris and his ability to answer difficult questions. Quote, "You'd catch him in some lie and press him on it," says Bowe, who would eventually depose Contegoris, "and he'd just start talking more and more loudly, like this, looking at you right in the eye, and whatever he said, he was absolutely sure about. You get so distracted listening to the way he talked, you wouldn't realize that nothing he said made any sense." What little early record there is of Contegoris shows him to have been sort of a celebrity hanger-on in LA in the early 90s when his brother Chris owned a nightclub called The Mint. Spyro was involved with some charities back then, including a camp for low-income kids called the Boney Pony Ranch, where he sat on the board and, according to Bloomberg, rubbed elbows with the likes of Richie and Renee Zellweger. In the mid-90s, a Greek shipping magnate named Dimitri Manios hired Spyro to renovate a brownstone property in Manhattan for him. This sent him down two different career paths, one in real estate development and one as an involuntary subject of litigation. He seemed to founder as the developer, but proved highly adept at getting sued. The two paths converged in 2002 when his real estate career ended with Manios firing him, and his career as a defendant began with the Manios family suing him for having embezzled millions from a series of real estate deals, including several big ones in Houston. In a detail that reveals Contegoris' mania for multiplicity, for being everywhere at once, the suit accuses Contegoris of boosting money from Manios through no fewer than 130 different bank accounts. This is like the Catch Me If You Can dude. Like, oh, I forget what his name, but that's the way I visualize him. Is like a jack of all trades, ultra confident, like con man is what this guy does. While Contegoris was in Houston, he seems to have gotten involved with a company called Hanover Compressor, which was based in the city. The company at that turn of the millennium was pushing a scheme to build a natural gas compression barge in Africa and was trawling the country for investors. Contegoris, the man whose last job known had been a glorified houseboy for a Greek shipping magnate, suddenly appeared as one of those, quote, investors, claiming to have put up $3.75 million into the African gas barge project. Where did he get that kind of money? Well, the Retiree Medical Benefits Trust of the Pirelli Armstrong Tire Corporation claimed he never had it. The retirees who claimed they were fraudulently induced to invest in Hanover sued Hanover and claimed that Contegoris was paid a secret sum of $1 million by the company to make what was actually a fully refundable $3.75 million investment in the barge deal as a scheme to inflate the value of the project. Confused yet? You should be. But what happened next begins to pull all this background into perspective. Contegoris became acquainted with Jeff Perry, who at the time was working for SAC Capital. So we've come full circle. Here we go. And began a new career in high finance for Contegoris. Perry, who out of all the characters in this story seems to be the most universally despised, quote, a bad guy, a constant accomplice problem, incapable of staying on anywhere very long, is how one hedge fund manager described him, is unique in that he actually worked for all three of the major funds in this case, SAC, Chanos, and Third Point, at various times during the Fairfax campaign. According to Fairfax's lawyers, Contegoris approached Perry when Perry was at SAC and sold him inside information about Hanover's fraudulent barge scheme. He had this inside knowledge to sell, they claim, because he had participated in the fraud himself. SAC from there placed a short bet on the company, a bet that later turned out to be profitable. Contegoris here was playing the role of Bud Fox in Wall Street, selling one piece of insider information he had, his own life, to get in with the big boys, and it worked. Around the same time that Contegoris was making his first contact with Perry at SAC, he showed up in the press, in a news article in the street, posing as an outraged investor determined to tell the world about the fraud that was at Hanover Compressor. In the piece, Contegoris claims that Hanover didn't have access to enough natural gas to make the deal work and knew as much all along. Boldly, he implies in the article that the entire deal was a scam to bilk Hanover's partners back home. Quote, Hanover had to know they couldn't perform, and if they knew that, then they must have had other motives for proceeding with the sale of the barge and guaranteeing a 2001 startup date to the partnership, he told The Street. The same article noted that the SEC had begun to investigate the company, and it's not hard to read between the lines and see that the investigation might have been instigated by Contegoris himself. So that's how they made a ton of money off of Hanover, and Contegoris got good at this. And basically what ended up happening is they hired him for, Perry ended up hiring him for the Fairfax thing, and it got off the track so fast. Contegoris was basically paying people and having some of his buddies call Fairfax's employees in the middle of the night and harass them. They wrote them multiple notes that threatened them. And basically they did the dirtiest stuff you can possibly imagine. I can't even remember all of it, but I mean, it was harassment, criminal stuff that they tried to do, and Fairfax didn't end up going under. They actually fought it off, and then, Contegoris ended up basically getting fired, going ballistic, and he was shunned by all of those billionaires I just talked to you about. So, without belaboring this too much, guys, suffice it to say that these Wall Streeters are as dirty as it gets. I mean the absolute most scum of the earth financial criminals you could possibly think of. And I mean that in terms of what they do on Wall Street with their trading, but also in terms of what they do to, these other companies just because they happen to they're trying to perform a short. So it's unbelievable. These guys are basically, psychopaths. And yet they never see the inside of a jail cell. And if they do, it's like Jordan Belfort. He ends up at a jail or a prison that has a fucking swimming pool for you to do laps in and a tennis court. Oh, man. they never actually go to prison. And yet, in the last chapter, chapter 5, we're talking all about, like, these immigrants can get picked up for nothing, end up in jail for nothing, or an ICE detainment facility. Black people can be picked up for nothing and forced into the ridiculously racist criminal justice system, either be by, cash bail that they can't pay, or fees and fines. It's a revolving door for money to be made off of poor people in this country. And if they can't pay, they end up in the private prison complex, which makes these companies even more money, and they get used as indentured servants. It's just, we've privatized slavery in this country through the private prison industry, and yet these Wall Streeters get away with murder. I mean, it's unbelievable what they get away with. So The Divide, it's a great book, and you can see why he called it The Divide, because that's been made apparent by every episode I've made for this book, and it's why I like it so much. Highly recommend you read it if you want to. Matt Taibbi is the writer. He writes very much like Hunter S. Thompson, but I mean, it's unbelievable. These and we haven't really come very far since the writing of this book, which was not that long ago. Wall Street's still getting away with everything. None of them have ever seen the inside of a jail cell. And if anything, the policing issue has gotten worse since the writing of this book. So we really need to change this. But that's why I do these book clubs. I try to educate myself and educate you guys along the way as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know that was a little bit long, but, the book's almost done. Also, last thing, I'm going to be reading another book coming up here. I think I'm going to read Holla If You Hear Me by Dyson. That's about Tupac. I think that's going to be the next book I do for the book club. And also, if you guys want, Ian, my sparring partner who I have on the show sometimes, he offered to read and make fun of Don Jr.'s book, Triggered, if you guys would watch it. So he told me to ask you guys if you would watch that. He will just read Triggered aloud and just make fun of it the entire time, or do a book club review basically making fun of Don Jr. If you guys will watch it, let me know in the comments if you would be interested in that. So keep fighting the good fight out there, guys. I'll talk to you later.